Everybody, this is Perch. I've been starting to think a little bit about which villains I think have been treated best and most poorly, or put another way, which villains have been more or less protected by their companies, and which ones have kind of been allowed to just turn into silliness. I think the reason why there's a lot of reasons why I think these villains at times will be threats 20, 30 years ago, but in 2022 they're treated like just ridiculous nonsense. And it's that writers get kind of embarrassed by the past, by things that worked, and rather than try and figure out how to, continue to make the villains threatening or continue to, kind of lean in maybe to some of the dated aspects of the villain. Instead, the writers just, they don't know what to do with it, so they make corny jokes, and they take the MCU quip kind of behavior into actual kind of the core writing of the tone of the book. And what's interesting is there's been some horror movies lately. We've seen this kind of nostalgia revival of a bunch of older properties. And what I think good writers are figuring out is even characters that are dated, characters that look like they came from the 70s and the 80s, if you just tweak it a little bit, but you keep parts of that, intact, the villain becomes more threatening and in some cases, appears crazier. I think we saw some of that with Halloween, even though that last movie was absolute nonsense. But anyway, I think there's a way to do it. I think that a lot of writers really really struggle with the kind of animal themed, type of villain. So in Spider-Man and in Batman, they just don't know what to do. I mean, I give what was it, Zeb Wells? I give him credit for kind of briefly making the Vulture look kind of angry, crazed, and out of control in the recent Amazing Spider-Man run, because most writers just, treat the character like a complete joke. This is one of Spider-Man's more major villains once upon a time, and, now it's a joke. Doc Ock got a brief revival. He had been kind of drifting into joke territory, and then I think Dan Slott did effectively try and make him more threatening. But now he's wandering back. I mean, I notice they're making more pudgy jokes, and they're kind of going down that route again. Craven at times. I mean, the funny part is one of the biggest kind of destroyer of villains, or destroyer of the kind of the seriousness, the lack of protection, was the comic Squirrel Girl, which increasingly I've just started to view as like a what the kind of comic. I mean, it has no impact in the rest of the lineup of Marvel comics, even when they did things like. Even they, Al Ewing attempted to use her in the USA Avengers, but by and large, there's been opportunities. Kelly Thompson did her West Coast Avengers. That seems like something the Squirrel Girl could have been thrown into. She declined to do that. I think at this point, the joke is over, and the comics are. I mean, they've got pictures of Squirrel Girl beating up Galactus and Thanos. I mean, Marvel by and large has protected Thanos as a villain. Now, every now and then he gets into kind of stupid stuff. They've done their best to try and make him, not do too much silliness, not do too much nonsense with Thanos. The closest it probably came was Brian Michael Bendis in Civil War II, having that we're going to jump Thanos before he really gets rolling, and he did some damage there, but still he was defeated in like half an issue or less. But by and large, Marvel tries to protect that character. But over in DC, I think DC, I believe, has done a generally better job. Now there, they've let a couple characters slip into silliness, but you're talking like Kite Man, Condiment Man. I mean, Tom King made them to be somewhat tragic jokes, etc. But you don't have as big a problem, I think, with villains. You have a problem where the villains don't accomplish much and they wind up doing kind of the same stuff again and again. It's like, the Joker's, burning Gotham down again. It must be a Tuesday. But by and large, while the villains get miswritten and mistreated, it's a different angle. So take, for example, this recent Mr. Freeze, One Bad Day, where it's revealed that, even though we've got, decades of complexity of Mr. Freeze, trying to save his wife, and, she's frozen, and would she even really want that? I mean, the entire story of Mister Freeze was a pretty good kind of parallel to, assisted suicide and some of these kind of aspects about, when somebody's time to die, can you let them go? And Mr. Freeze couldn't, and as a result, he kind of murdered people and enacted crimes in order to try and restore her. But that something just dawned on me. I'll tell you in a second. But um, that whole aspect it brought questions up. How far would you go for the ones you love, and that kind of thing. So it was an interesting, complex villain. And then recently, Jerry Duggan decided to take the story and reveal that actually Mr. Freeze was, possessive of his wife, didn't like her going out, didn't like her having friends, and so, now that she's frozen, he gets to kind of keep her intact. And the problem is that entire reveal of the story is dumb in comparison. I mean, it doesn't quite explain why Victor Freeze became Mr. Freeze, why he put himself. I mean, why would he do that? So he kind of inflicted himself with his freeze technology because he wanted his wife frozen. Like there's aspects that no longer make sense at all in that story. It did dawn on me that the Mr. Freeze that we got in One Bad Day is really kind of the. It makes me wonder if Jerry Duggan, his kind of only experience of Mr. Freeze was the Batman and Robin, the movie where Arnold Schwarzenegger played Mr. Freeze, and it showed him at various times being kind of tempted by poison ivy and just kind of wisecracking and like if that's the only basis by which Jerry Duggan knows a character, it would explain a lot actually of how it came about. There's a possibility that's more accurate than any of us want to accept. But anyway, um, but even there, so even this Mr. Freeze thing, it's different from making the villain just pathetic and ludicrous. It's character assassination. Certainly, it eliminates some big, interesting kind of complexity and nuance to the character. But it isn't. It isn't like they made him a jokey, nonsensical character. Still bad. This is not a defense. It's pointing out that of the two companies, Marvel allows their villains to drift more into just silly territory. I mean, look, you have. I was recently going back and rereading the original run of the X-Men. The Stan Lee, Kirby, and everything else. And it was funny because they had like villain of the week for a while, and the story of the Blob and kind of how the Blob came about. I had forgotten that the Blob was kind of trying to run the carnival, and he was they kind of almost built him up as a mob boss. That's how, I don't want to say clever. Just it was interesting how they went about that. And then you flash forward to today, and the Blob is somebody who's horny for Psylocke, as we learned in Age of X-Man, and and then now just a bartender. He's happy being a bartender. It's interesting to see Marvel takes the villains and makes them, in the words of Gen Z Twitter people, pathetic meow meow men. Um, you mean pussies? Is that what you mean? I don't know. Anyway, they they tend to do that, and almost to a villain, they've all experienced this to some extent. Kang has, Doctor Doom has, the Ultron has. They've let their villains just turn into kind of silly nonsense. And DC, they will kind of, in a weird way, kind of wreck the villain. They'll take the villain and make the villain either dull or kind of repetitive, or like the case of Mr. Freeze, rewrite the origin. Both are bad, but that's more or less where it goes. So kind of to the original question, what villains have been protected better than most? I think Thanos is one. Doctor Doom, you could sort of put him on there. I'm thinking about the arch villains kind of in everything. I mean, Spider-Man, they've all gone through the ringer at various times. I think we're building up to at what point is Norman Osborn going to snap again, but right now he's being a white hat. Um, they're you just don't. Do you have any villains that when they show up in a Marvel comic, you're like, oh shit, some stuff's going to go down here? I think by and large, a lot of them have. You know, I was reminded of the Wrecking Crew, and I was talking to an artist back in, I want to say, the early '90s. It was a long time ago, and young Perch was asking, the Wrecking Crew is kind of a joke villain team now. And the artist is like, well, yeah, I mean, the Wrecking Crew is like the Village People. That's how people see them now. They're very much a '70s team. They show up in their wrecking equipment, and even though they have like Asgardian kind of stuff, writers look at that and go, "There's just no way we can make a guy who like swings around a wrecking ball and has a crowbar, terrorizing." Now, a few like 5-6 years earlier, they had a pretty brutal assault in the Avengers, but whatever. But basically, that was the language, and I remember thinking even at that time, like if you wanted to, you could still make them threatening. They could still kill people with those silly weapons, and in fact, if you write it well, the fact that you have these construction workers killing people becomes more terrifying if you write it, because it's like you have somebody in kind of a dated, silly costume, and they're there's blood dripping off that wrecking ball. You could do some damage. That's that would have more weight. I remember we were having this discussion. It's like, well, but they're not like Sabretooth. Sabretooth is like a out of control bestial character, and Sabretooth will never be dated. So that was the claim. But the Wrecking Crew, it's just, what can you do with a '70s Village People knockoff team? It's not even right. Like the Village People had like a policeman in there and some other thing. They weren't all just construction work. Anyway, there's an Indian guy. Anyway, oh well, whatever. But by and large, I think all of the Marvel villains have slipped into that now. It's like, oh, the Rhino is kind of dated. Oh, so let's make him like he wants to protect children, and he's kind of silly, and all these characters have become sappy. And I mean, even like the Red Skull has become an internet meme for white supremacy, not actually a threatening, villain that can cause some chaos, murder some people. Was it the Jeff Johns storyline, the Avengers? This is before Disassembled, where the Red Skull had once again he infiltrated Washington because that's what he does, and he's always getting in there. And then he'd put some poison gas. He's like just murdering people, and it was going to be bad, and he was super threatening. As I recall, the Falcon came in. Jeff Johns wrote that, I believe. Anyway, it was a good story, and the Red Skull came off as threatening. Today, the Red Skull is kind of an internet help guru modeled after Jordan Peterson. Anyway, what villains have I forgot? What villains have been more or less protected from kind of stupid nonsense? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, of course, and thanks for listening.